Hello, welcome to the Philip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum Virtual Speaker Series, where we have paleontology guests calling for a presentation on science, fossils, and dinosaurs, and where the public will be able to ask questions live on YouTube. First off, we want to acknowledge that we are on the homeland of the many diverse First Nations and Métis people whose ancestors have walked this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to work, live, and learn on the traditional territory of Treaty 8. Today, Jared Voris will be presenting a dynasty recorded in stone, Alberta's fossil record of Tyrannosaur dinosaurs. Jared received a Bachelor of Science in Geology with a minor in Biology from Appalachian State University and a master's degree from the University of Calgary researching the growth of Alberta Tyrannosaur, Gorgosaurus Labrados. Jared is currently a PhD student at the University of Calgary researching the growth and evolution of Tyrannosaurs and other theropods from here in Alberta. Jared most recently led in the discovery of the earliest known Canadian Tyrannosaur, Theropod. Thank you for joining us today, Jared. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much for having me. So again, my name is Jared Voris. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Calgary. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the Tyrannosaurs that we used to be having here in Alberta. And we've been able to glean this information from hundreds of Tyrannosaur fossils that have been found all over the province. And so I'm going to be trying to touch a little bit of everything when it comes to the biology of this group, including their ecologies, as well as many of the significant discoveries that have been made about the members of this group. So Tyrannosaurs are among the most famous and are quite possibly the most famous dinosaur. And if you were to ask just about anyone to name a dinosaur off the top of their head, the vast majority would say T-Rex, and this is really unsurprising given how popular this one species just is. This is one of the few animals where most people know the entire scientific name for the species, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and it's oftentimes portrayed as the antagonist or sometimes even the protagonist of most dinosaur-themed popular media. And plus to that, it's just this big, scary predator, and it just makes it very interesting to the public. But what is often not realized is that T-Rex is actually just one species of an incredibly diverse group of theropod dinosaurs that included over a dozen species of these giant bone-crushing apex predators, as well as some of these smaller and more agile species. But all of these different species, big and small, are actually united by a set of characteristics which we can use to distinguish Tyrannosaur fossils from those of other theropod dinosaurs. And these include things like having this singular nasal bone. And this is actually quite different from what we see in most of our other theropods like Allosaurus here, in which they usually have two nasal bones, one on the left and one on the right side. In Tyrannosaurs, these two nasal bones have actually become fused over time into that singular bone you can see here on the top. Tyrannosaurs also have this very uniquely shaped snout, and this is most easily seen in the bone that we call the premaxilla. And this bone is fitted with these very diagnostic incisor-like teeth in this side-by-side arrangement. And this is quite different from what we see in our other theropods, like you can see in the bottom right corner, which usually have these more blade-like premaxillary teeth oriented in this more front-to-back type style. Now, here in Alberta, we're actually incredibly lucky in that a large percentage of our land area, especially in the southwest areas of the province, have a lot of exposed rock layers which are rich in dinosaur and other vertebrate fossils. And this has led to Alberta being among the best places in the world for researching dinosaur paleontology. And in particularly, we have an incredibly diverse Tyrannosaur fossil record, which has produced some exceptionally well-preserved specimens of multiple Tyrannosaur species. And in fact, much of what we know about Tyrannosaur biology has come about thanks to discoveries that were made right here in Alberta. And so again, the vast majority of these fossils come from the Badlands and the southern Alberta plains, and the bedrock of this region is made up, for the most part, a largely uninterrupted sequence of rock layers that span the last 18 million years of the Cretaceous, dating from around 84 to 66 million years in age. And these layers are extremely significant for researching and understanding Tyrannosaurs, as they record almost the entire length of time when Tyrannosaurs dominated the Earth as these giant apex predators. And so we're going to explore a little bit of the different Tyrannosaur species that we can find here in Alberta and what it is they've been able to tell us. But in order to do that, I'm maybe going to do something that's a little bit counterintuitive. Instead of moving forward in time from our earlier record of Tyrannosaurs to our later Tyrannosaurs that occur, we're actually going to go work our way down through the rock layers. So we're going to work our way backwards through time, starting at the very end of the Cretaceous at the swan song of the reign of the dinosaurs. And so I'm sure that many of you are already aware of the events that actually led to the extinction of the dinosaurs, but just for a short recap, around 66 million years ago, a colossal asteroid impacted the Yucatan Peninsula, and this event was catastrophic for most life forms living on Earth at the time, and it actually led to the extinction of nearly 75% of all species, and this included the extinction of all non-bird dinosaurs, including the Tyrannosaurs. And the last living species of Tyrannosaur here in North America was actually none other than Tyrannosaurus Rex. And T-Rex has actually lived here in North America from between 67 to 66 million years ago when that asteroid hit the Earth, which is actually a very short window of time compared to some of the other Tyrannosaur species that we'll be talking about later on. So Tyrannosaurus is the largest known species of Tyrannosaur that we know of, and also sits as one of the largest theropods and largest land predators to have ever existed. At adult size, T-Rex was about the size of a school bus, measuring 12 meters in length and weighing somewhere between 8 and 14 metric tons. And compared to many other theropod dinosaurs, Tyrannosaurus fossils are actually quite common. There have been dozens of specimens been found over the years, including several fairly complete skeletons. And these specimens have been found all across Western North America, from as far north as here in Alberta near the town of Huxley, with a range extending at least as far south as New Mexico and Texas, and potentially even as far south as Mexico. And because we have so many specimens, in addition to its popularity, this has led to Tyrannosaurus Rex being very heavily studied. And in fact, there are more publications on T-Rex alone than there are for many other animal species. And so we've been able to learn a lot about the biology of this animal over the years, despite the fact that it went extinct 66 million years ago. So for example, some of these studies have looked at the CT scans of skulls, of T-Rex skulls, and from this, paleontologists have been able to create digital reconstructions of T-Rex brains and other soft tissues, and this has been used to help further our understanding of the sensory capabilities of Tyrannosaurus Rex. And from this, we've been able to determine that T-Rex had a very acute sense of smell, as well as this superb hawk-like vision. Bite marks have also been found on fossils attributed to potential prey items of Tyrannosaurus Rex, like Triceratopsid and Montosaurus, and these have led to further studies looking at the bite forces or capabilities of T-Rex, and these studies estimate that T-Rex had a bite force of around 8,000 pounds, or about the weight of 2 large cars. And we even have studies reporting fossilized T-Rex skin impressions, which show that this animal had scaly reptilian-like skin and perhaps didn't have the feathers that some of these smaller Tyrannosaur ancestors probably had. So here in Alberta, T-Rex fossils can be found in 2 different rock layers that we call the Scollard and the Willow Creek formations. And despite the fact that there are quite a few fossils of T-Rex specimens known, the vast majority of specimens that are found of T-Rex are actually found in the US and predominantly come from the rock layers known as the Hell Creek Formation found in Montana and South Dakota. Here in Alberta, the Scollard and Willow Creek formations don't preserve fossils quite as well or as commonly as do those similar aged rocks in the USA. But despite that, there have been a few noteworthy discoveries over the years of Tyrannosaurus specimens here in Alberta. And among the more famous of these specimens is the T-Rex specimen that's commonly referred to as Black Beauty. And this was discovered back in 1980 by a group of young boys while they were fishing after school. And at first, all they were finding were these small black fragments of bone that were coming out of a hill nearby. But when they showed their teacher, they realized the significance of this discovery. And so the teacher got into contact with staff at the Royal Trout Museum, who then launched an excavation of the site to find an incredibly well-preserved T-Rex specimen. And so Black Beauty has actually been very important for helping paleontologists understand growth in T-Rex, as it actually represents a younger individual than some of our other famous T-Rex specimens like Sue that's at the Field Museum in Chicago, or Scotty at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. And so T-Rex actually had a lot of features which distinguish it from most other North American tyrannosaurs. So in addition to its large body size, it also had a much lower number of teeth in its jaws than other Tyrannosaur species. And this is largely attributed to the T-Rex also having these relatively larger teeth, which resulted in their jaws being unable to accommodate those higher tooth counts like we see in some of our other species that we'll be talking about later on. So it's essentially a trade-off between having these higher tooth counts versus having these really large teeth. We also find that T-Rex didn't have this prominent horn on the top of the bone that sits in front of its eye socket, the bone that we call the lacrimal bone. And instead, the top edge of this bone is actually quite flat in T-Rex. And this is due to a very large air sac that sits inside this bone. And this same air sac isn't nearly as large in other Tyrannosaur species, which makes the relief of this horn much more prominent in those other species. We also find that the outer jaw, the outer surface of the upper jaw of T-Rex was also ornamented with these really thick, prominent ridges that separated the shallow oval-shaped depressions that are located just above the tooth row here. And what's interesting about all these features, though, is that while we can use these to distinguish T-Rex from other Tyrannosaur species here in North America, these same features can also be seen in, or these same features actually are seen in other Tyrannosaurs from Mongolia and China. And this actually tells us that Tyrannosaurus Rex was actually not originally native to North America and was instead likely a derivative of one of these Asian Tyrannosaur lineages that had immigrated into North America by crossing a land bridge that connects what is now modern-day Alaska and Russia. And so this is what's quite interesting. And what's actually interesting about this is that Tyrannosaur species that were living in North America just prior to the appearance of Tyrannosaurus Rex in North America. And so it's actually possible that the arrival of T-Rex might have been a contributing factor in the extinction of some of these other Tyrannosaurus species. And so one of these species was actually Albertosaurus sarcophagus. And actually compared to T-Rex and many other Tyrannosaur species, Albertosaurus was actually more lightly built. It had longer hind limbs, and its skulls didn't have quite the same number, or quite the same features that facilitated quite a high bite force as some of those other more robust Tyrannosaurs like T-Rex were capable of producing. But they still had these very powerful, incredibly powerful bone-crushing bites. So Albertosaurus fossils are principally found in the rock unit known as the Horseshoe Canyon Formation and are quite abundant in the Drumheller Valley, but have been found as far north as Edmonton. And these layers date to around 71 to 69 million years of age. So again, just a few million years prior to the appearance of Tyrannosaurus Rex in our North American record. So Albertosaurus was actually among the first Tyrannosaurs that were discovered in Western North America, with the holotype specimen that is figured here on the left being found by Joseph B. Terrell while he was surveying the geology of Alberta in 1884. And then shortly thereafter, a second specimen that's figured here on the right was actually found by Thomas Cheston in 1889. And at the time of discovery, these specimens were considered to just be Western occurrences of an already named but smaller Tyrannosaur that could be found in New Jersey called Displetosaurus. And it actually wasn't until 1905 that it was realized by Henry Fairfield Osborn, a paleontologist at the American Museum of Natural History, that these specimens represented an entirely different species from Displetosaurus. And so Osborn established them as this new genus and species, naming them Albertosaurus after Alberta, which had just been erected to province status that very same year. And one of the little facts that I kind of find interesting is that Albertosaurus and Tyrannosaurus Rex were actually named in the same publication, with T-Rex being named just 3 pages earlier. And because of the code that governs the naming of new species and groups, because the name Tyrannosaurus came first in that document, it actually takes precedence over the name of the entire group. And this is why we call all of these animals Tyrannosaurs. But if Albertosaurus had been named just 3 pages earlier, we'd instead be calling this group the Albertosaurs instead of the Tyrannosaurs. So one of the more peculiar discoveries when it comes to Albertosaurus fossils are fossils that come from a bone bed in Dry Island Provincial Park. And this bone bed has yielded fossils of over a dozen Albertosaurus individuals that would have been buried together during a very short window of time. And because we have so many individuals clustered in one area, this site has led to studies suggesting that there might have been some degree of sociality or some kind of grouping behavior within Albertosaurus. But the unfortunate side of this is that we have no way of determining if this bone bed preserves some kind of packing behavior like what we see in lions, something like Albertosaurus, or if it's preserved something like Albertosaurus scavenging on carcasses, which is something like what we can see happening in the Arctic Circle with typically solitary polar bears being attracted to a mass scavenging site on whale carcasses occasionally, or potentially if this represents some other event entirely. But there are other fossils that we can use to provide us with evidence of some kind of social behavior in Tyrannosaurs. One site in British Columbia that corresponds to ages similar to those of Albertosaurus fossils here in Alberta preserves footprints of 3 different Tyrannosaur individuals walking in the same direction. And while we can't know what species made these tracks, that does provide, again, some kind of evidence that there might have been some kind of social behavior that occurred in Tyrannosaurs. So preceding Albertosaurus fossils by a few million years, we have fossils of another Tyrannosaur, a very similar Tyrannosaur species called Gorgosaurus Labrados. And this species is one of the more common Tyrannosaurs that we find fossils of here in Alberta, with there having been dozens of skeletons discovered in the province since larger scale field excavations began in the early 1900s. Gorgosaurus is actually very closely related to Albertosaurus, and the two are actually occasionally even regarded as just being separate species of Albertosaurus. So Gorgosaurus fossils are found primarily in the Dinosaur Park Formation of southern Alberta, but are also more rarely found in the upper part of the slightly older or the slightly earlier Old Man Formation. And these correspond to an age of around 75.6 to 77 million years for this particular species. So as with T-Rex, there are a bunch of features that we can actually use to distinguish Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus both from other Tyrannosaurs that we can find here in Alberta. For example, both Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus can be distinguished from these other Tyrannosaurs by the shape of those lacrimal horns. And these are much more pointed and more forward in their position than what we see in some of our other Tyrannosaur species. We also see that we have this hole in the upper jaw that we call the maxillary fenestra. And this maxillary fenestra is much smaller in Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus than in our other Albertan Tyrannosaurs, like Displetosaurus that you can see here in the bottom right corner, or otherwise our T-Rex specimens that we talked about earlier. The nasal bone, or the bone that sits right along the top of the snout of Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus, are also shaped a little differently than our other Tyrannosaur species that we have here in Alberta. So, for example, in Gorgosaurus, the width of the nasal is largely consistent as we move backwards along the length of this bone, which is different than what we see in some of our other Tyrannosaurs like Displetosaurus, in which the nasal actually begins to narrow as we get closer to its back end. We also see that the front end of the nasal bone is also shaped differently. In Gorgosaurus, we actually see that there are these three separate points at the very front tip of it, with two on either side of one on the middle. And in contrast, in our other Tyrannosaurs, we actually find that we only have these two side points. We don't have that middle point there. So with Gorgosaurus fossils being so common, we've actually been able to learn a lot about the life history of Tyrannosaurs through this particular species. And we've been able to learn a lot about Tyrannosaur growth. And in fact, Gorgosaurus is one of the few Tyrannosaurs that we have a really complete growth series for that includes fossils of some of these smaller and younger juvenile individuals all the way through these larger adult animals. And recently, in fact, this growth series has been expanded thanks to the discovery of two exceptionally well-preserved juvenile Gorgosaurus specimens at the Royal Trout Museum. And these two individuals represent some of the smallest articulated Tyrannosaur skeletons that have been found in North America. And these two specimens in particular demonstrate just how significant the changes that Tyrannosaurs underwent as they matured. Oh, excuse me. And so what we see is that our younger and smaller individuals of Gorgosaurus and other Tyrannosaurs had these incredibly long hind limbs relative to the rest of their body size. And their skulls and skeletons were overall much more lightly built. And they also had these very narrow blade-like teeth that would have been much better suited for cutting through flesh than crushing bone. But as they got older, these Tyrannosaurs bulked up in mass significantly. Their hind limbs became much shorter with respect to their overall body size, and their skulls and skeletons became much more robust, and their jaws became became much more powerfully built, and were fitted with these much larger and more conical shaped teeth. And it was these features that actually facilitated some of those incredibly powerful bone-crushing bites that we see large Tyrannosaurs having. And these such extreme differences between the overall builds of juvenile and adult Tyrannosaurs suggest that these different age groups likely had different ecological roles, where these fleeter-footed juveniles were likely preying on smaller and faster prey, such as oviraptorid or ornithomimid dinosaurs, where adults were likely preying on slower and heavier prey like ceratopsids and hadrosaurs. And so this highlights a very interesting ecological dynamic where Tyrannosaurs were actually dominating multiple predator roles throughout their lifetime, including both apex predator and these lower tier predator roles. And this is quite different than what we see in other dinosaur-dominated ecosystems, as well as very different from what we see in our modern ecosystems, where different species generally occupy these different ecological roles. So for example, if we were to compare Tyrannosaur ecosystems to the modern Africa plain, we would compare juvenile Tyrannosaurs to being very similar to what we see modern cheetahs taking on in terms of their ecological role, where adult Tyrannosaurs were much more similar to what you would see with modern day lions. Now, interestingly, Gorgosaurus is actually not the only Tyrannosaur that we can find fossils of here in Alberta from this time period. We can also find fossils of another Tyrannosaur species called Displetosaurus in these very same rock layers. And so Displetosaurus again comes from that same time period as Albertosaurus, from the Dinosaur Park and Old Man formations, and they can be found around for that 75.6 to 77 million years in age. But what would end up actually being named as the holotype or the namesake specimen of Displetosaurus was actually discovered back in 1921, and it was largely considered to be another specimen of Gorgosaurus for nearly 50 years until 1970, when paleontologist Dale Russell realized it to be something completely different. And since then, we've made several additional discoveries of this genus, which includes some very well-preserved specimens, like the exploded Tyrannosaur skull that you may have seen on display at the Royal Trout Museum. And it's also been discovered that there were actually two different species of Displetosaurus that were separated by a small window of time. We have one species that can be found here in the Dinosaur Park and Old Man formations here in Alberta that's called Displetosaurus turosus. And then we have a slightly younger species that occurs in younger deposits or younger rock layers in Montana that's called Displetosaurus horneri. And one interesting note is that while we find fossils of Displetosaurus and Gorgosaurus in the same rock layers, we actually find that Gorgosaurus fossils are more than 2 times as abundant here in Alberta in the Dinosaur Park formation. But this dynamic actually starts to change as we start to move further south, where it actually seems that Displetosaurus fossils tend to become much more common as you move into places like Montana. And so this might suggest that there might have been some sort of geographic separation between these two groups, where Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus represented a more northerly lineage than perhaps Displetosaurus and other related species. But this geographic separation can actually be taken further than just going on between here in Alberta and Montana, because as we move further south into rocks in places like Utah and New Mexico, we find that there are entirely different Tyrannosaur species there as well. And in fact, we don't find any of these species here in Alberta. And so this suggests there were essentially 2 different Tyrannosaur zones, one here in the north, which includes Montana and Alberta, and one in the south. So Displetosaurus can be distinguished from other Tyrannosaurs by a wide range of features of their skull, and these include their upper jaw, some features that we see in their upper jaws. If we look on the outer surface of the upper jaw of Displetosaurus, we see that it has these deep branching channels that meander across the outer surface there, and it gives this bone is almost scale-like texturing. And we don't see the same kind of patterning in most of our other Tyrannosaur species. We also find that in addition to the horns that we talked about situated in front of the eye, in that bone in front of the eye, the lacrimal bone, Displetosaurus also had these very large horns on the bone that's situated behind the eye as well, the bone that we call the postorbital. And these are relatively larger than similar structures that we see in other Tyrannosaur species. Displetosaurus also has these much more oval-shaped orbits, which is and the orbit is the cavity that would have held the eyeball in life. And this oval shape contrasts with what we see in some of our other Tyrannosaur species, which usually have this much more comma or apostrophe-shaped eye cavity. Now, other features of Displetosaurus we can actually use to help determine where this particular species falls or where this particular genus falls in terms of our Tyrannosaur family tree. And in particular, because Displetosaurus has a more robust skull, thicker teeth, and a heavier body frame than similar-sized individuals of, say, Gorgosaurus or Albertosaurus, and the fact that these features are kind of similar to what we see in T-Rex and our Asian Tarbosaurus, it actually suggests that the Displetosaurus might actually be more closely related to Tyrannosaurus and Tarbosaurus than our other Tyrannosaurs like Gorgosaurus and Albertosaurus are. Now, as we move further down in our rock layers, we actually find that there isn't nearly as much diagnostic fossil material that's preserved here in Alberta when compared to those more rich fossil-bearing formations like the Dinosaur Park and Horseshoe Canyon formations. But we have found some fossils in the rock layers situated just below that Old Man and Dinosaur Park formations from the units known as the foremost formation. And these include the Pachycephalosaurs Colepiocephali, as well as the ceratopsid of the horned dinosaur known as Dinoceratops. But until recently, we haven't had much of a record of Tyrannosaurs from this unit until recently, when a Tyrannosaur was discovered from this formation by a friend of mine named John DeGroot, who found skull bones from this Tyrannosaur in this formation near his ranch while he was walking along the Bow River with his family. And it was recently when we actually discovered that these Tyrannosaur skull bones had features that we don't see in other Tyrannosaur species. And so because of this, we were able to determine that this represented a new species of Tyrannosaur that we called Thanatothrustes degrootorum, naming after John and his family. So Thanatothrustes is the oldest Tyrannosaur that we've been able to find diagnostic fossil material of here in Alberta, again coming from that time window of around 79.5 million years in age. And this makes it nearly 2.5 million years younger or 2.5 million years older than our next occurring Tyrannosaur species of Gorgosaurus and Displetosaurus. And what we find particularly interesting when we compare the bones of Thanatothrustes to those of other Tyrannosaur species is that we find that Thanatothrustes exhibit similarities to two separate lineages that includes these more T-Rex-like species and a second lineage that includes, again, these more Displetosaurus-like species. And we can actually look at some of those features that kind of split the difference there. So for example, if we look at the outer surface of the upper jaw of Thanatothrustes, we see that it has those same prominent ridges, like if you recall what we see going on, or what we see that characterize the maxilla or the upper jaw of species like Tyrannosaurus and Tarbosaurus. But at the same time, it also has that those deep branching grooves and that scale-like patterning of bone, like what we see going on in Displetosaurus. The jugal or the cheekbone of Thanatothrustes is also quite similar to what we see in the Asian Tarbosaurus, in that the part of the bone that forms the bottom of the eye socket is actually much thicker and is much more rounded in cross section. And this differs from what we see in Displetosaurus, where there's a thin blade-like edge that forms the upper part of that contact, or forms the margin of that eye cavity there. And so looking in at a zoomed-in version of our Tyrannosaur family tree, because Thanatothrustes has characteristics of both these Displetosaurus-like and these Tyrannosaurus-like species, it suggests that this animal might actually occur very close to the evolutionary split between these two separate lineages. And we can also use this to further our understanding of the geography of these two different lineages. And so what this suggests is that around 80 to 79 million years ago, a Tyrannosaur very similar to Thanatothrustes degrutorum had a range that spanned across both North America and Asia, or alternatively actually immigrated from here in North America into Asia. But regardless, over time, this North American and Asian populations became separate or became isolated from one another, eventually resulting in an entirely different species arising in these two different areas, with Displetosaurus arising here in Alberta and Tarbosaurus and another Tyrannosaur like Zhucheng tyrannus arising in Asia. Then again, if you'll recall, as I mentioned earlier, around 67 million years ago, we actually see the return of Tyrannosaurus Rex back into North America shortly before the extinction of the Tyrannosaurs. So Thanatothrustes has provided us with this very interesting window into understanding the origins and biology of these two separate lineages. And this is something that the discovery of additional specimens will undoubtedly help to clarify further. Now, unfortunately, as we start to work even further back in time in our Alberta fossil record, and we've moved further down in our Albertan rock layers, we start to encounter a little bit of a problem. From around 80 to 100 million years ago, we have this huge global gap in our dinosaur fossil record where there just aren't that many rocks that preserve dinosaur fossils, and there are even less that preserve fossils very well. And so there just aren't that many dinosaur fossils known from this time period, and this includes tyrannosaurs. And what's upsetting is that somewhere within this gap happens a critical moment in the evolutionary history of tyrannosaurs. So earlier than this, tyrannosaurs were these smaller-bodied animals and weren't the apex predators that most are probably familiar with. Instead, you can think of them as being very much like what we have with modern-day coyotes in their ecosystem, not the apex predator, but something lower down in that ecology. But fortunately, we are beginning to narrow this gap. In the last 5 years or so, 3 different Tyrannosaur species have been found in rock layers from around the world, which all date to around 90 million years in age. And this does help to reduce the size of this gap from 20 million years to 10 million years. But even with these new discoveries, we're still lacking fossils from that critical time period in the evolutionary history of tyrannosaurs. Again, these fossils that have been discovered aren't from those larger body sizes, so we really don't know much about what it is that allowed tyrannosaurs to jump into that apex predator ecology. But here in Alberta, there is one rock formation from within this 10 million year gap that does rarely preserve dinosaur fossils. The Milk River Formation found at the very southernmost edge of Alberta has in particular produced a few isolated teeth, which come from a tyrannosaur that would have roamed Alberta nearly 4 million years before Thanatothrustes during what is called the Santonian age of the Cretaceous, or just around 84 million years ago. And while we don't know much about this particular tyrannosaur yet, we can tell from the size and shape of its teeth that it would have came from a larger apex predator, much like those other tyrannosaurs that we were talking about earlier. And this is very important because in addition to being the oldest tyrannosaur that we have fossils of from here in Alberta, These fossils represent one of the earliest records of a large-bodied Tyrannosaur from anywhere in the world. And so they have the great potential for helping us to further unravel the evolution and even the origins of some of the larger bodied members of this group. And while we don't know much about this particular Tyrannosaur, I just said that. But more than just the Milk River Formation, there are other poorly explored and potentially fossil-bearing rock layers here in Alberta that correspond to these time periods when these Tyrannosaurs were still smaller bodied. And so there's a possibility that there are fossils from some of these smaller species right here in Alberta that we just haven't found yet. And it's something that more paleontological field work it will have to be done in order to see if we can find some places like this. But there are rock layers, again, that can potentially help us in the future doing this. But one of the problems with that paleontologists often encounter is that many of these places are quite remote, and we unfortunately can't devote as much time to prospect for these new fossil localities and some of these places that we'd like, as much time as we'd like to. And I think this is a really good place to plug how important the public is in terms of paleontology. And the public is much better poised to make some of these groundbreaking discoveries oftentimes than paleontologists are. And so if you're out there in some of these more potentially fossil-bearing areas, keep an eye out for fossils, as it could represent a groundbreaking discovery, groundbreaking paleontological discovery, and potentially even, fingers crossed, could be a new species of Tyrannosaur or represent one of these groundbreaking Tyrannosaur discoveries. Which, by the way, if you ever think you have something significant, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always super interested in looking for new fossil localities, especially in some of these places that we've really failed to explore quite as well as we probably should have. But it's also important not to diminish the significance of continued paleontological fieldwork in places like Dinosaur Provincial Park, as there's still much that we don't know about the biology of even our more common Tyrannosaur species like Gorgosaurus and like T-Rex. And so more discoveries of these specimens or these species can really help us to understand that biology even further. And so this highlights that despite being perhaps the most famous of all dinosaur groups, that there's still a lot that we can learn about Tyrannosaurs. And I think that Alberta in particular is going to continue to be a center for many of these groundbreaking discoveries. And so with that, there's a lot of people that I would like to thank. I would like to thank my funding sources who have helped me significantly during the course of my projects, as well as several people that I'd like to personally thank for their continued support in these projects. And I'd also like to thank everybody for coming out and listening to this talk. And I hope it's been fun for you all. And I hope that you've learned something interesting about Tyrannosaurs that maybe you didn't know before. And with that, I guess can take any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you so much, Jared. That was very interesting. I certainly learned a lot. Okay, so like Jared said, we're going to now move into our question period. And if anyone has any other questions, just type them in the YouTube link, and then I will read them out loud. All right, so first question. Are the nasals fused in immature specimens as well? And if not, at what age did they start fusing, coming from koi?
Yes. As far as we're aware, Tyrannosaur nasals are fused in our earliest representative, in the earliest ontogenetic stages, or the youngest Tyrannosaur fossils that we have. The youngest representative in particular comes from a specimen of Tarbosaurus that was found in Asia a few years back. And this individual had a skull length of just about 20-30 centimeters long. So a very small Tyrannosaur individual, and the nasals are completely fused in that individual as well. So it does appear that the nasals fuse very early in the life history of Tyrannosaurs, yeah.
Great. Next question. Didn't the teeth count change between different juvenile and adult Tyrannosaurs?
Yes, in T-Rex in particular, it seems that there's a strong evidence that as they got larger, so they started off with more teeth in their jaws when they were younger, but as they started to mature, those teeth became larger. And again, they couldn't fit quite as many in their jaws. So they actually started to reduce the number of teeth that they had, at least in T-Rex in particular and in Tarbosaurus as well. And it seems like there might be some evidence of that in other Tyrannosaurs as well, but it's something that we need more juvenile animals of in order to be sure.
Next question. With the morphology, even teeth of juveniles and adults being so very different, was there a time when people thought that there were two different species? And if so, what caused them to change their minds?
Yes, so this is the longstanding issue that's always been going on regarding, or that's been going on regarding the validity of like Nanotyrannus lencensis, which is a supposed small-bodied Tyrannosaur that coexisted with Tyrannosaurus Rex. Yeah, so the skull morphology and the tooth morphology are quite different between these specimens that have been referred to as Nanotyrannus. But thanks to the discovery of intermediate forms and also the discovery of intermediate growth stages between those Nanotyrannus or the specimens referred to as Nanotyrannus and adult T-Rex, as well as other studies looking at the ages of those Tyrannosaurs, so looking at something called bone histology, which basically counts the growth rings inside of the limb bones of Tyrannosaurs. We've been able to determine that these what used to be considered dwarf Tyrannosaurs are actually just different growth stages of those larger body Tyrannosaurs.
Great. I think what this question is asking is how many years does an animal become an adult in Tyrannosaurs?
From what we can best tell, it kind of varies. And that might be due to the fact that we don't have quite as many fossils of really large, really big adult animals for some species. But it seems like it took around 18 years or so for Tyrannosaurs to reach their large body size. After that point, they started to kind of hit a plateau. Somewhere between 15 and 18 years is basically when they start to plateau a little bit into that really large body size. But Tyrannosaur fossils, we found Tyrannosaur fossils that date to around 30 years in age. So it seems like our largest individuals were around that 30 years of age mark.
Perfect, thank you. Why is Tyrannosaur provincialism so marked?
We're not really quite sure. There's been some hypotheses that there might be some sort of geographic barrier located between Montana, somewhere like Montana and Utah. One of the ideas that I've actually heard thought is that maybe the zone between the Rocky Mountains then and the shorefront for what is called the Bear Paw Sea or the Intercontinental Seaway would have been very narrow. So there wouldn't have been much habitat for dinosaurs to exist. And so it may have created like kind of a beachfront barrier in a way that prevented dinosaurs from actually moving between those two provinces too easily. But in actuality, we really don't know yet. And it's something that better work looking at the stratigraphy and trying to understand the environments that might have existed between places like Montana and here in Alberta and places like Utah could potentially help us to understand.
Alex would like to know if you're aware of the Tyrannosaurid generally known from the early Cretaceous Catamine Formation of Alberta.
I have heard talk that there could be Tyrannosaurs from that formation, but I have never seen any fossils of this animal. But it does correspond to the time period when Tyrannosaurs were still small, so around that 90 million year mark. So I haven't seen any fossils of it, but it would be definitely something worth looking into and something that's really interesting to me.
Next question from Christian. Given distributional communication between Asia and Laramidea, is it likely that long-snouted tyrannosaurs, for example, Alioramines, sorry, I mispronounced that one, might be recovered from Alberta?
It's always possible. We currently have no record of Alioramines here in North America. It seems like there might have been a bigger disparity in the ecologies of things like Tarbosaurus and Alioramus than there would have been between Alioramus and Gorgosaurus and Displetosaurus here. So it's potentially something that has to do with Tarbosaurus having that large body size over in Asia, and then Alioramans being able to take up a niche that represents one of the smaller and lower tier predator niches there. That's something that we can't really see. Maybe that we might not have the capability of allowing here in North American ecosystems from that time period. But it's still something that could be on the table and something that more paleontological work from the places like Dinosaur Provincial Park could help to reveal.
Next question. Did those ridges on T-Rex maxilla have any functional significance?
We don't know. One of the things one of the ideas that I'm kind of partial to is that these ridges and the scaling that you also see in like Displetosaurus are associated potentially with some kind of with the scale morphology or the fleshy morphology that we would have seen on the outer surface of those upper jaws. unfortunately, because we don't have a Tyrannosaur mummy or something that preserves skin impressions from the facial region, we don't really know what that might be. But it might have been some kind of display structure. So maybe it was infused, maybe it allowed for them to look sexier in a way. And that might explain why we see such variation in the shapes of those different morphologies between different Tyrannosaur species.
Another question from Alex: is it possible that Albertosaurian lineage of Tyrannosaurus split off from Thanatothrustes, or would their ancestor be older?
It's more likely, I think, based on what we currently understand about Thanatothrustes, that Albertosaurians split off earlier from the common ancestor of, that Albertosaurians were a much more basal lineage. It seems more likely that Thanatothrustes is much more close to the split between Displetosaurus and say T-Rex than it would be to the split of Albertosaurians, which would have occurred much earlier on, probably around 83, 82 million years ago, somewhere in that time range.
Moving on to a bit of a fun question. Do you have a favorite specimen that you've gotten to research?
My favorite specimen, I guess, would probably have to be the one that I kind of got my start on, which is one of those juvenile Tyrannosaurs that you saw pictures of earlier. It's a small Gorgosaurus that is kind of one of the first ones that I really studied in detail. And I think it was one of the first Tyrannosaurs that I actually was able to physically touch. And that was a very special experience for me. And I really remember that. It kind of just stands out in my mind as like one of my favorite experiences. So I guess that specimen in particular kind of stands out as my favorite.
All right, I'll just give a moment to see if anyone has any more questions to come in. Caleb would like to know, could there be a foremost formation Albertosaurinae?
There absolutely could be. And it's hard to say though, because we don't know, there's no way of really determining the difference between Albertosaurine and Displetosaurine or Displetosaurus teeth. We don't really know of a good way of distinguishing between those two. So if we find isolated teeth, we can't really tell. But if the same biogeographic patterns hold between the dinosaur park and the old man formations as they do in the foremost formation, then we might expect to see fossils of an Albertosaurine there as well. It's also possible that Albertosaurines weren't in that area that the foremost formation is actually outcropping at the time. Maybe the environment was different, so maybe they are not there. We won't really know until we get more fossil discoveries from that formation. And the foremost formation is actually really important, I think. Because one of the things that I kind of always say about it is that if the foremost formation were in any other place other than Alberta, it would have been very heavily explored by now. But because we have such amazingly diverse fossil records in like the Dinosaur Park Formation and Horseshoe Canyon formations, the foremost formation has unfortunately gone underexplored. So I think there's a lot of discoveries waiting to be made in that rock layer and potentially even other rock layers here in Alberta as well.
Christian says, I read that a theropod tooth was found in the Cretaceous marine deposits of Comox Valley in British Columbia. Do you know if it's from a tyrannosaur?
Unfortunately, I don't know of any of this situation that's being referred to personally. If it comes from the Cretaceous, it would depend on when in the Cretaceous that it comes from, and it also depends on how large this animal is. So if it were a larger tooth, it would depend on if it were to come from the late Cretaceous, right? So that time period when tyrannosaurs were around. So if that were the case, then it would very likely be a tyrannosaur, or would most likely be a tyrannosaur, I suppose. But if it were to come from an earlier deposit in British Columbia, something from before tyrannosaurs actually had gotten to that large body size, then it might be something else, maybe something like an allosaur or a Carcharodontosaur or something like that. I'm not aware of that situation, so unfortunately, I can't really speak to that, unfortunately.
Next question from Koi. Can you differentiate the three tyrannosaurid groups, Albertosaurine, Displetosaurine, and Tyrannosaurine, based on any isolated postcranial elements?
The problem is that postcranial research has been kind of underdone, and it's something that we're looking into in the near future. But there are features that have been shown before that do distinguish between Albertosaurians, Displetosaurus, and Tyrannosaur, and like the Tyrannosaurians or Tyrannosaurus-like species, those ones from Asia. A lot of times they have to deal with being more robust, right? So the bones of T-Rex, a metatarsal or something like that, in T-Rex would be much more robust and much more squat than would, say, the same metatarsal from a specimen of Albertosaurus or Gorgosaurus. There are other features as well. So like Albertosaurians have shorter ilia. So the hip bone called the ilium, their ilia are much shorter than what we see in other similar sized individuals of things like Displetosaurus and T-Rex. But there are features that distinguish them. It's just something that's been less explored compared to features in their skull.
Next question from Trevor. What is the status of the Tyrannosaur material found in the Iguaja Formation of the southern United States? Do you have any speculation on the identification?
I'm not super aware of that material. I don't know of any publications that's really described it. And maybe there are, and maybe I'm just like not remembering them. So I really can't speak to that right now, unfortunately. But if you have a paper about this, by all means, send it my way. I would be more than happy to read it if I haven't seen it before.
Last question. What are your next plans moving forward?
Next plans are associated more so with publishing the work that we were doing that was kind of associated with my master's, with looking at those juvenile Gorgosaurus specimens. As well as we have a whole bunch of research looking more into the Tyrannosaur biology, things that have kind of been underexplored in the past regarding Tyrannosaur growth and evolution. And so there's some really interesting discoveries that I think that are waiting to be made in Alberta. And I'm also still looking for new things that we can actually discover. And there's more things that I discover every time that I go to places like the Royal Trout Museum. So there's still a lot on the docket. And there's other things too that are not Tyrannosaur related, but maybe in the future we can talk about those later on.
Fantastic. All right, thank you so much, Jared. Join us again February 6th as Alexis Bazinet will be presenting bird fossil feathers from the Maccabee fossil beds. Right. Take care.
Thank you very much.